Hey everyone, welcome. Rach, did you want to give us a
Welcome.
little?
Welcome to our panel, Conjuring the Past, Artifacts of Memory. We're so excited to be here and to have these awesome authors to chat with tonight. We will talk about them in just a second, but I thought we would introduce ourselves. I'm Rachel Kuntz, and that's Courtney Sexton. We are co-founders of The Inner Loop, which is a literary arts nonprofit in the Washington, D.C. area. And we provide monthly readings and retreats, summer residency. We do a podcast called the Inner Loop Radio. And we just make it our mission to support writers in the DC area and give them a community. So we're really happy to be here to discuss nonfiction because we are also both nonfiction writers. And this is a topic that's very close to our heart.
Yeah, we're thrilled to be joining you all for Fall for the Book. And I would love to introduce our two authors for the panel today. Elissa Washuta is a member of the Cowlitz Indian tribe and a nonfiction writer. She's the author of White Magic, My Body is a Book of Rules, and Starvation Mode. With Teresa Warburton, she's the co-editor of the anthology Shapes of Native Nonfiction, collected essays by contemporary writers. And she's received lots of fellowships and awards and is currently an assistant professor at Ohio State in the creative writing department. So we'll be chatting with Elissa. And Lilly Dancyger is the author of Negative Space, out this year, a purported and illustrated memoir selected by Carmen Maria Machado as winner of the Santa Fe Writers Project Literary Awards. Lilly is also a contributing editor at Catapult, an assistant editor at Beckle House Books, which we love here in DC. Her writing has been published by many awesome outlets, and she's hanging out in New York City these days. Welcome to you both.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Hi.
So I wanted to talk about memoir as a genre. It's kind of one of those wily ones that doesn't want to be pinned down. So I thought, like all good nonfiction things, that I would start with a quote. This is from Vivian Gornick. She says, "Truth in memoir is achieved not through a recital of actual events. It is achieved when the reader comes to believe that the writer is working hard to engage with the experience at hand. What happened to the writer is not what matters. What matters is the large sense that the writer is able to make of what happened. For that, the power of a writing imagination is required." So I just wondered what you guys thought about the importance of turning life experiences into stories, and what effect do those stories have, and how much does facts go into it? Let's start with Lilly.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with, the heart of that quote, that the specific events are really not the point in most memoir. It's about what you make of those events and kind of the translation of experience into art. And that's what sets, memoir or personal essay apart from just an anecdote or, a story you might tell at a bar. Sorry if you can hear that siren going by outside. And I think it's that meaning making that allows readers to connect and to see themselves in creative nonfiction and to feel emotionally invested in it. When they're going along with the writer, making something bigger out of their experiences. I was just having a conversation the other day with somebody about why there are so few happy memoirs and why creative nonfiction tends to be made out of the harder experiences. And I think, in my experience, at least, those are the things that I need to turn to the page to make sense of. I don't need to find meaning in happy things that make me feel good. They make me feel good, and that's enough. But it's the hard stuff that I need to dig into and make sense of and create something out of. And memoir is the way that I found to do that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm so glad you read that Gornick quote, because that was something that was really influential to me when I first started writing nonfiction. I think, yeah, all those happy things are just sort of uncomplicated, and they're, I don't know, I'm busy paying attention to them in my real life, like those are the things I'm not trying to look away from, I'm trying to spend all my time looking at them, or as much as possible. My relationship, my cat, my house, those things are not complicated. I think that the essay is where I need to go. At least it has been in the past. It has been, where I need to go to look at things that I find very difficult to look at, and find, that they have this stubborn presence in my life, these problems that I have, these, wounds that won't heal, pains that won't go away. But I think that lately I've been writing something that is sort of challenging my own ideas about situation and story, as Gornick talked about. I'm writing something that's really linear, and it's about the events that, the events are the meat of the essay. And I don't know what to do with that. I keep worrying, what am I going to do? I don't have any new insights to make about this. But I think that, there's this other area I'm kind of moving into where I know everything about this subject I'm writing about, but not a lot of other people do. And I just have this like strong desire to let my curiosity like bleed out and, share it with other people. That's a bad mixed metaphor, but, but I think that, that's still an experience of, feeling and interior experience being what is really driving the writing. I'm not a journalist, but I do care about being factual. But, really it is the way that I bring voice, that I bring meaning, that I arrange the perceptions, that is the heart of everything that I write.
Yeah, thanks to you both for that. Before we move on, just to kind of follow up, Rachel and I talk about this a lot, actually. And how do you write about trauma in a way that isn't just saying like, then this happened and then this happened, and how do you do it in a way that is, therapy on the page is great. That's what I use writing for too, right? But how do we make that, not necessarily therapeutic for others, but part of a bigger story of humanity, right? Like, what are some of
your broader audience?
Yeah, what are some of the tricks and tools maybe that you all have found in trying to get to these deeply personal narratives?
Mm-hmm. Elissa?
I think that, for me, it's been a long time since I needed to get to them. There was definitely a time early in my essay writing when I was doing the excavation. Once I got there, once I realized, what I was hiding from myself and what I needed to bring to the page, I think that what became the obsession that I, carry into my writing now that I'm not writing about trauma anymore lately is this desire to make the experience legible to other people, especially when I was, first working on My Body as a Book of Rules. I was like 22, and I think the conversations around sexual violence were really different back then, and I felt like I needed to create the thing in the world that would allow that would be like my insistence on being understood. And, so my, I think that, I think a lot in like bad metaphor. And I think that like, for me, the memoir is just, an act of like me reaching for all my bad metaphors and all of my analogies and all my cultural touch points, like Law and Order, bringing someone closer to my experience or an understanding of my experience by, talking about Law and Order episodes. Everybody's seen those.
It's true. Law and Order is accessible to everyone. Lily, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this answer and then trying to think about whether it was really true or not. But I think it is true that I don't really write about things when I'm still in the processing therapeutic mode. I tend to kind of mull for a long time. And then once I find something interesting or something unexpected or something that I have to say about an experience that's, that layer beyond this is a thing that happened and, it made me feel feelings, that's when I start to dig into it on the page, right? When I find a thread that I can follow that feels like it will allow me to find something interesting and something even maybe beautiful about something that otherwise just sucks, right? Because otherwise you're just sitting with it and it's something hard. But then if it starts to turn itself into an opportunity for art making, then that's what drives me to the page, because that feels like a way to kind of take control over it in a way and make something better out of it so that you're not just sitting with it.
Yeah, I really like what you're saying about making something crappy beautiful. There's something so powerful about that, and I think you're right. It's like a taking it back, something horrible. I also liked how you said you were thinking about your answer and at the same time asking yourself if it was true. I feel like that's a great segue into
totally.
For the essayist, but so I'm gonna let Courtney throw this next.
Yeah, and I just also want to throw in there, you both touched on this idea of writing as a means of controlling things, and I love that as a nonfictioner. But so another quote for you all to dig into. Roy Peter Clark in The Line Between Fact and Fiction says, because we're always trying to draw that line, right? Or maybe erase it. The way we remember things is not necessarily the way they were. This makes memoir, by definition, a form in which reality and imagination blur into, quote, a fourth genre. And my question for you is, how do you know when you're telling the truth? And what is that memoir's responsibility to truth versus fact, or fact versus truth? Lily, I'm going to poke at you because you you brought us to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are kind of two versions of testing the truth of something that you're writing. There's like the factual reality truth, did this happen on this day? Were these the people that were there? Were these the things that were said? And to some extent, those can be fact checked sometimes, not always, through research or interviews, which I did a lot of, collected as much factual material as I could. But then I think the harder and murkier and kind of more interesting question of truth is whether something is emotionally true, and I found myself a lot of times writing something that sounded good, right? It felt like a next step in the story that would feel satisfying or redemptive or dramatic or whatever, and like was close to the truth and sounded good. And so I would put it down on the page and then I would look at it and say, no, that's not right. And that's not really how I feel, and it took several layers of revision of like pushing on those spots where I had articulated something that was maybe neater, simpler, cleaner than the reality. And a lot of my revision was actually making the story messier. So in a way to make it truer. And, looking at those spots where I kind of wrote what I wanted the story to be and then cracking them open and seeing the contradictions and the discomfort and the unresolved nature of what was actually under there and trying to pin that down as much as possible. And when I could articulate that mess, that's when I was really telling the truth.
Yeah, I think, so I have a terrible memory, and it's just like full.
I do too.
It's like, it's getting worse all the time, and I don't know how that is now that I'm sober. How is it getting so much worse? But I do a lot of work to go through old emails and, stuff like that to fact check to the extent that I can on, the events and all of that. But yeah, like Lily's saying, I think the emotional truth can be really, really hard. And at some point I just decided to accept it. And this is like a little bit different than what Lily was talking about, I think, but the difficult place for me is when I am writing about what I was thinking and feeling and what was true for me in the past, in the moment, which, there's no way for me to really know that a lot of the time. I can kind of guess it based on what I did. I can remember the emotions around the emotions in a moment, but I don't have the whole tapestry. So I just have to kind of like fill things in. It doesn't feel bad to me. I think I realized that at some point. It feels fine to kind of fill in like that, because first of all, I mean, I forgot what I was going to say. First of all, it is a way to sort of like fill in those memories for me in a way, which can be dangerous, I guess, but it's like I have something where I had nothing in some instances. I have meaning where things were meaningless, and that was part of the problem. And then I think, as far as the reader is concerned, I think the experience I owe the reader is of me making this meaning in the present. So I don't think it's like violating my contract with the reader to reconstruct some of those emotions, because I know that character of, 22-year-old Elissa Washuta or whatever. I know that character better than anybody does. So if anybody's going to know what she was thinking, I think it's me.
Fair enough.
Rachel, can you relate to that?
Yeah. Yeah, I write a lot from the very, very much younger version of myself. So it takes a lot of imagination, but also not that much, because it was me once upon a time. Okay, so I'm going to get into a little bit of specifics. Elissa, I'm going to start with you. In white magic, you often refer to objects that carry multiple meanings that then interweave throughout the book, most notably the title. But then you also use magic and its trinkets as a kind of scaffolding to explore the themes of the book, your identity, different iterations thereof. Can you say more about how you use objects to convey meaning?
Yeah, I think it was in white magic, the process I was going through, I think of those things, and I think this is what you're talking about. I think of like these motifs and these things that I kept going back to. I wanted or needed the meaning to be a little bit elusive, because I needed to follow it through the course of the writing. So, there's these various like things like jackrabbits and magicians and the idea of white magic and, all of these things that sort of function as motifs or like recurring symbols. I really wanted the meaning to sort of be unsettled, not just for the reader, but definitely for me. Really, I mean, the process was just that when I was doing research and I was going from place to place in, the source material I was bringing in, these things kept coming up. Magicians kept coming up, rabbits kept coming up, the name Alice kept coming up, all of this. And I didn't know what that meant. I had nothing, there were some instances where it just seemed really weird. And I wanted to give the reader that experience of synchronicity that I was having. And so, as far as like the title goes, I don't think I can ever really pin down exactly what it means to me. And the same is true for so many of these other things. I think the backbone of the book is, these structural, I don't know, these patterns and also cycles. And I think that the primary function through a lot of the writing was just keeping me interested. I just found what I was finding so fascinating. And that was one of those things I just had to share. I just had to show people how weird it was to keep finding the same, these same symbols over and over.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you say you were leaving it open because it felt open to you, because I feel like that allows the reader to read into it as much as they want or need to. Lilly, I feel like you similarly use artifacts of your father's life as almost a kind of scaffolding and to drive the development of the main characters. What's your feeling toward using objects in nonfiction?
Yeah, I mean, the art was really my way into the story. It was my like treasure map, right? When trying to get to a fuller picture of my father. And, the realization that he had left me all of these kind of coded messages about himself and his life and his inner life specifically, because that's what I couldn't get from anybody else. I could interview people. I got tons and tons of stories about him, like way more than I ever could have included in the book. But the art was the closest I got to interviewing him directly. And it was just about studying and trying to find the meaning in them without oversimplifying. That was definitely another moment where that question of truth, right? There were some points where I was kind of reaching toward a convenient meaning for a piece, right? But then I had his voice over my shoulder, just like, this disapproving look when I felt like I was oversimplifying, right? Or flattening the work in some way. So I was threading this line of making meaning while also kind of similarly to what you were saying, Elissa, leaving it open-ended, because I didn't know for sure either, right? So I could make some guesses. I could put images next to story in a way that implied meaning or showed the meaning that I felt was being implied already by the work, without like kind of sucking the mystery out of it too much. And I think that's a really, that was my experience specifically with the art, but I think that can work for so many different things, right? Whether it's a physical object or a symbol or a movie or anything, whatever you're writing about, just kind of circling it and trying on different meanings can allow you to follow it through an essay or a book or whatever, right? And I think it's always a matter of that kind of tightrope walking, right? Where if you find the one definite answer, then you're done, right? Then maybe it's a tweet and not an essay or a book, right? But if you're following, possible meanings or things that are gesturing toward meanings, and you're allowed to follow one to another and allow them to change over time as the story develops, that can be a shape for a piece of writing.
Yeah, I really like the idea of circling something that feels poignant. You just have to keep circling it until it reveals itself.
Yeah, and as a reader, I found that strategy really helpful in both of your books. It gave me some touchstones to come back to. And also, there are moments, you both are exploring some really heavy stuff throughout the books, and having these images that weren't necessarily drawn for me, but ones that I could interpret a little bit differently, helped to let me keep pace with all of kind of what might have otherwise been overwhelming. So I think that worked really beautifully in both of your works. I'm gonna, maybe a spoiler alert for those who haven't read Lilly's book, but I think it may be apparent at this point, at this space. In negative space, you make this distinct choice, I think, on where to start the story on the page, which is not necessarily where it starts for you, right? But that, of course, impacts the reader's experience of it. How and why do you choose to start kind of opening with the death of your father? One, and follow on to that. You also say early on that it didn't really matter how he died, when you follow that right with, kind of thinking about all these ways that he may have. So it seems like it is important. In writing for truth, are you also kind of uncovering truths in your own perception of reality? So that's a two-part question. One, where to enter and why, and two, uncovering truth in your perception.
I tried so many structures for the story that was the part that took the longest to figure out. It's like this endless, torturous game of Jenga, like moving everything up and up and up and up. But starting with his death, I think just made sense to me, because that was what showed the reader right away what the stakes were. I was about to go on this book-length search, and I had to make it clear early on why. And I felt, if I just started with the beginning of the search, which is me at 20 years old reading my father's notebooks, you're missing some context of the weight of that decision, the everything that it meant to me to read those, and why that then spurred this whole big search. So I wanted to introduce the reader to, my grieving 12-year-old self, and make them feel for that child version of me, so that they would understand why my 20-year-old self was still that person, and needing to go on this search. I also liked the symmetry of it, because it starts with his death and ends with his death. And it's because there are, multiple narrative strands. And so I think of the beginning as the beginning of my storyline, which is me as a grieving daughter and all of the shapes that takes in my life. But then it ends with the end of his storyline. And I liked the circular, symmetrical nature of that. This was satisfying to me. And then, definitely a lot of the writing process was me learning things about how I felt and what I thought. And, deciding when he died, it mattered a lot to me how he died. It was very important to me that it was not an overdose, because there's so much judgment around that. And I felt so defensive of him. And nobody said it directly, but I felt this idea from the adults that it had been his fault, and I wanted to push back against that. And so the fact that, the coroner, spoiler alert, right? Again, but that there was no official cause of death meant a lot to me as a 12-year-old. And then it was only later in piecing this story together that I realized, like, that was not ever really the point, right? The point is that he was gone, and fault and is too simple of an idea anyway. And addiction is more complicated than that. And if it had been an overdose, or it had been long-term damage from heroin use, or it had just been a freak thing, the result was the same. And so digging into kind of how important that detail had been to me as a kid, and then kind of the more complex version of reality later, was one of those moments of like pushing on how I thought I felt, and trying to determine how true that really was.
This is messier than I want it to be moment. Elissa, similarly, obviously in different ways and for different reasons, but you play with time and structure throughout the book. And, what is your process in making those kinds of choices in terms of where to enter into certain scenes and how long to stay there?
It's hard. It's, dealing with time is always really hard for me. I noticed that, in my earliest drafts, there's lots of tense mixing because I can't figure out where I want to be in time. And I'm very conscious of it, but I just have to let it stay in there. Like this sentence feels like it should be in present tense, and this one feels like it should be in past tense. And I know that's because it's very important to me to locate a narrative present. And so that was, just a big, I guess like an issue of arrangement for the book in some ways. I needed to have, so as I'm working on writing something, that process of like finding answers that we've been talking about, that's the plot of the book. And so that plot needs to happen over time, but it's not necessarily going to be, I need to sort of like fudge a little bit when it comes to what the time period is that I'm writing the essay, because it might, it'll take me, it's just, I'll go back to stuff like we all do, set something aside, decide it's garbage, come back 3 years later, whatever. So I need to decide when that narrative present is going to be. And so for White Magic, there was just a lot of, after I got everything together, I just needed to adjust. Well, first I needed to kind of think about a temporal scheme. Like, what is the thing that I have come to say? What is the thing that I'm trying to figure out? Unfortunately, I realized that the narrative question was, why won't my ex-boyfriend text me back? And I was hoping it'd be more profound, but that's what I had, a few essays in. And so I realized, okay, the first chunk of the book is, the narrative present it was basically the same as the time I was writing those essays, pining away in Ohio, missing my ex-boyfriend, and then had to go into the past, because a question, that question, why won't, who knows why my ex-boyfriend wouldn't text me back, but why do I care? That question, in order to answer that question, I needed to go back way before I met him and think about, the last few years, getting sober before that, being in an abusive relationship before that, and just my whole history. And so that needed to be encapsulated too. And then I needed to move back to, after I'd gotten myself up to speed about why I am this way, I had to go back to that original narrative present and continue there to figure out, okay, now I know that this had to do with all of these different things. So what am I going to do with that information? Can I get over him? I think the question became, and so that was the sort of overall container of the book. But it's so hard to figure out what that's going to be in the early drafting process.
Yeah, I talk about, and this is a very real thing. I literally will print pages out and cut them apart, move them around each other and say, where do you work? And it's that in itself is both time and space, like visually. And again, coming back to the visual elements in both of your books, I think they play off of each other really well.
I did that with my whole manuscript. I covered all the walls of my apartment. And
great.
Completely. Yeah.
I'm glad to know I'm not alone.
It's funny because I feel like we've been talking about scaffolding and creating a structure, and it's a tough line to draw, because you don't know the structure until you start writing, and then once you figure out the structure, then you're like, well, now I have to go back and change everything, or at least move it around to make it make sense with how it wants to be. It's very much like art has a life of its own. Court, did you want to do the last question about multimedia?
Sorry, I'm muted here. Yeah, this is kind of, again, just building off of the discussion we've been having, and you both have these sort of multimedia approaches, which we've dissected a little bit, but I'm wondering, do you think that being female identifying writers demands that you tell a history, either your history or any history that you're digging into with memoir or nonfiction or otherwise, in a certain way or in a certain form? Or I guess the multimedia thing like kind of got me thinking on this path. I don't know. But there's like the question about form, and then also like, are you obligated in some way to uncover pasts that are marked by society's influence on women? Do you feel that in this genre in particular? And I will leave that up to whoever wants to take the first stab.
So I think I'm not sure. You know, I know what immediately came to mind is that being Native, the expectation is that I will be telling the story of my ancestors' trauma. And I do, it's kind of like something that I am now exploring in my work and have been exploring, like, why do I feel like I keep having to talk about this? I do think that being a woman and having all of these experiences of not being believed by men about various things, like whether it's, terrible things that have happened to me or my medical ailments or whatever, I feel like there's always this strong desire to explain myself to the world. And so I do think that informs my writing. I mean, that's why like this thing is like 400 pages, because I need to explain why, why the sexualization of representations of Native women is bad. Like why, I don't know, whatever things I've been trying to get across. I do think that, thinking about something Lilly said earlier, like I can't do it in a tweet. I can't do it in a thread. I need to have a lot of, just a lot of stuff, and not just my, it's not just about me. Obviously it's, it is about history, and I bring in film and TV and video games and all of that, because it does constantly feel like I need to have some sort of proof, which has been an obsession in my work, or some kind of larger significance. I always have to point out, that it's not just about me, because, it being about me really is not enough.
I feel like I was definitely aware of stereotypes or, tropes that I didn't want to fall into. And I don't think I was aware at the beginning that they were so gendered, but that became clearer later. I started writing the book when I was 21 and was just like, I don't want to write a whiny thing about like my dead dad, and I had all these internalized ideas about what a young woman writing about grief would look like, and all the ways that it could be cheesy and saccharine and whatever. And, maybe some of that was like internalized misogyny. But I think it also was an awareness that if I didn't really actively push against those, that was how my work was going to be read. Even if I was doing, deep, rigorous intellectual work alongside writing about my dead dad, it would just be slapped with that label if I wasn't like continuously and vigilantly kind of subverting those expectations throughout. So I think I was kind of in this dance throughout where I was like avoiding being overly emotional or melodramatic or whatever, and then having to be pushed by editors to like put some emotion on the page, because you do have to give some of that, right? And you have to be vulnerable, and you have to be open, and all of these things that I had convinced myself was going to be cheesy. And it was only finally in like year 8 or 9 of writing this book that I was like, okay, I'm confident enough in my writing now to know that it's not going to be cheesy and saccharine and self-indulgent, and I just have to go for it and put the vulnerable, messy, scary things out there without like prejudging them. And it's okay, the work has merit. It's not, you know, a silly little book, right? But that was, you know, that was definitely a lot of gendered, and, you know, just thinking about the ways that so many books by women are marketed and being afraid of that. Yeah, I think it creates these like traps for us in trying to avoid these pitfalls. We end up like retreating too far, and kind of navigating that is something I'm still trying to figure out.
Totally. Aren't we all?
I feel like, you know, I went through this painful process after White Magic was finished. I had some painful realizations that it wasn't about me. It wasn't about the book, that even if I could write something that I was really confident was, it like was not melodramatic, it still was labeled that way by some readers because it's not about the book. It's not about me. It's not about my writing. It's about the fact that, you know, talking about pain is,
the faux pas.
Yeah, basically, it's like you're not. It's not serious. It's seen as not serious. I should be writing about who knows what. I don't know what to write about, obviously.
Well, I think
that perception is dead wrong. So.
Yeah. And this idea. Sorry, Rach. That message of being vulnerable, like being open with yourself and true to yourself enough to be vulnerable, I think is really important for every writer to hear. And with that, Rach, do you want to throw up?
Yeah,
we have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah, we have a few audience questions, and I think this first one is actually pretty relevant to what we're already talking about. But somebody had a follow-up question to kind of, when do you know you're ready to start writing about a traumatic event, which I feel like, you know, Courtney and I have talked about a lot on the podcast, and it's really a hard question because I don't think there's a clear answer, but maybe Elissa and Lilly, you could talk about how you knew when you were ready to start writing. Lilly, you mentioned that you normally process it for a long time before you sit down to write it, but you're also processing on the page. So maybe talk a little bit more about what that fine line is.
Yeah, I think there's a switch where, you know, I'm no longer fixating on the experience, but I start fixating on what I want to write about it. You know, and I think at that point when you're like thinking of phrasing or metaphors or other things you could incorporate or whatever while you're like in the shower or doing your grocery shopping and whatever, you know, when it's like bursting out of you, then that means it's time. And that doesn't mean it's not still going to be hard and scary and painful, and that you're not going to still need to go slowly and take a lot of breaks and all of that. But I tend to, I think, follow the writing rather than trying to force it, right? And say like, okay, this is a thing that happened to me. I must have something to say about it. Let me just like cut open my veins and see what comes out on the page. That, I don't know, I that hasn't worked for me in the few times I've tried it, and it just feels kind of, I can feel the self-exploitation happening when I'm just like trying to wring content out of pain, right? Whereas like when something starts to turn itself into story naturally, and I feel like I have something to say about it, then I follow that, even if I know it's still going to be difficult.
Yeah, I think, you know, you can do it whenever you want. The results will vary, I think. And I don't necessarily mean varying in quality. So there's a couple things to this for me. So my first book I was writing about things that happened, trauma that was a couple years old. As I was writing it, new extremely traumatic things were happening, and I was writing about them like the next day. And I don't think the work suffered for it. I know I suffered for it. I was in a lot of emotional pain. It was extremely bad for me. And with White Magic, I think I was very aware of that. I'd been teaching for a while, and so I'd been seeing writers pushing themselves sometimes to write about things, just because they needed to write about something for class. And I could see, from the outside how I had been as a grad student, when I saw people pushing themselves on that schedule over the years. So anyway, with White Magic, I was writing about some things as they were happening, but they were not super traumatic things. They were just things I didn't like my ex-boyfriend not texting me back. The trauma in the book was old. It had been processed in therapy. And I think it's still intense, but in a very different way. Instead of it just like bursting out of me and having to be on the page, I did have to really pry some of it out. I knew it was there, but I had to sort of like pry it out and get it on the page in a different way. I really wanted to, though. I was pushing myself to do it because I knew that was where the insight was, and I had to. I was also very aware of my emotions and, just my, the effects that trauma has had on me by then, and was able to pay attention to when I was getting triggered in the process. Was no longer drinking. So wasn't like actively hurting myself through the process, and actually was in a place where I could take care of myself. So, I mean, that's what I recommend, is just doing it when you, wherever you stand with the trauma, doing it when you have support and when you are able to really recognize what it's doing to you.
Totally. That's excellent advice. Having a good support system when you revisit trauma. Thank you both so much. This has been such an amazing discussion, and thank you for sharing your stories and sharing your process. It's been so great. Please pick up Lily's book, Negative Space, and Elissa's book, White Magic, at your local bookseller. And thank you all so much for joining us on this Fall for the Book panel.
Thank you, Lilly and Elissa.
Thanks so much.
So much.
Talking with you. Bye.